What if you could sit down with Jesus? What if you could hear his words, ask your hardest questions, and experience his truth firsthand? Through the Gospel of Matthew, we step into real conversations, real encounters, real challenges, real answers. Join us for Conversations with Jesus.
Well, good morning. My name's Randy. I'm one of the pastors here. Happy Easter. I found out recently that I have believed wrong for decades. I had been told that Easter was a pagan holiday rooted in the worship of Ishtar, the goddess of Babylon. And I found out from a guy that studies languages that Easter is, because English is a Germanic language, excuse me, and Easter comes from another German word that's too long for me to pronounce. I don't know what it is, but anyway, it is rooted in a Latin word that means Pascha, which is Passover. And it has nothing to do, etymologically speaking, which means where words come from, with Ishtar. I found out that the bunnies are not about fertility gods. They just happened in the 1800s, and it was a way to get, another holiday to be commercialized. Yep. That's all that's about. So it's okay to say Happy Easter. How many of you are just glad you came today now? I mean, that's Happy Easter. He's risen. He is risen. Come on. Boy, that's good. I can't get over it. So good. I just want to read to you Matthew's version of the resurrection. Matthew 28, verse 1, if you have your little Matthew buckets in there. After the Sabbath at dawn on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to see the tomb. People say, well, who's the other Mary? She's mentioned in chapter 27. She's the mother of James and Joseph, who nobody knows for sure who they are. So she's the other Mary, and that's all we know. Okay, suddenly there was a great earthquake. Now, what Matthew wants you to understand is that the ladies got there right after this earthquake. Okay? And you'll see for a reason why. For an angel of the Lord descended from heaven, rolled away the stone, and sat on it. Don't you love that visual? That is an angelic way of doing a mic drop. Move the stone, sit on it. Tell you that. Isn't that great? His appearance was like lightning, and his clothes were as white as snow. Now, what's interesting here is how many times he and Jesus tell the ladies not to fear, but they don't tell the guards to not fear. Because look what happens. The guards trembled in fear of him and became like dead men. Think about hardened Roman soldiers who have seen all sorts of horrible, horrible things in their life as a Roman soldier. And this was so frightening that it literally just conked them out. It was overwhelming. I mean, get the visual of that. Wow. But now here's when the ladies come in. And they see the guards laying down and the stone rolled away and the angels sitting up there. But the angel said to the woman, don't be afraid, for I know that you're looking for Jesus who was crucified. He's not here. He has risen, just as he said. Come, see the place where he lay. Then go quickly and tell his disciples he's risen from the dead and is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you'll see him. See? I've told you. So they hurried away from the tomb in fear and great joy and ran to tell his disciples. I was listening to one scholar say the reason God chose to tell women is because if it had happened to men, the women would have said, well, what happened? It was cool. And well, it's just an amazing day. So God chose to reveal himself to women so the message would get out. Come on now. You know, I'm preaching. Jesus met them and said, greetings. And it's just funny. Like all this understatement. The angel sitting on the rock. Jesus, morning. They came to him, grasped his feet, and worshiped him. Could you imagine? Not only is he resurrected, are you catching the idea that this man was whipped to within an inch of his life? He could hardly carry his cross. He was so much damaged. So not only is he resurrected, though he still wears the scars, the pain is not there. You know, he's not going, oh, careful, don't touch me, don't, oh, get. He's fine. He's just fine. And he says, do not be afraid, said Jesus. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee. There they will see me. You see that statement, brothers? The Bible is very clear that Jesus died to bring many sons and daughters to glory, but that we might be adopted. He chooses his language very carefully. Tell my brothers. They've been adopted. I know they all ran away. I know they were all big chickens, and I love them. I just accept them right where they are. Now, if you're a follower of Jesus, this is all such good news. If you've been in church very long in your life and you've not really brought this from here down to here, it's a little far-fetched. I mean, this is far-fetched. You know, my first year of seminary, a friend of mine who had been a friend of mine in college, who was also a pastor, saw something that I still have a hard time believing. He said that he was in a meeting, and in the morning he saw a man worshiping with one hand and the other hand was missing, his whole arm. And that night he came back and that man was standing there like this. He said, some men prayed for me this morning and my arm grew out. This is a friend of mine. This isn't some weird story. My friend went home and spent 4 days alone, locked in his room, because he could not fathom something that profound. And I bet many of you are sitting here going, Randy, come on, that's just too far-fetched. But the risen Jesus is even more far-fetched. It's even more far-fetched. It's crazy that someone would be crucified and be resurrected from the dead. It strains everyone. In fact, even his followers couldn't believe it. Yeah. So I want to ask you a few questions. How do we know the resurrection actually happened? I've based my message on the scholarly work of these three men. You see right here, Frank Turek, N.T. Wright, Tim Mackey. If you ever want to go to YouTube and look at any of these guys, or if you want to ever read any of their books, these are profound scholars that are so in love with Jesus. They're delightful men. So interesting to me that Jesus had told his disciples 3 times in Matthew that he would die and be resurrected. Before he died, he told them 3 times, look, guys, I'm going to be crucified, and then I'm going to be resurrected on the 3rd day. And every one of them, virtually every one of them, forgot about it or didn't believe it. And what's crazy is when you read Matthew, Jesus' enemies, the Sanhedrin, the leaders of the religious council, remembered that Jesus had said that and said to Pilate the governor, look, that deceiver told us that he would be raised after 3 days. So could we put a guard over the tomb just to make sure that his disciples don't come and steal his body? They remembered that he said he would be resurrected, but the disciples didn't. Because it was so crazy to imagine someone being raised from the dead. The disciples were completely confused, scared, and unclear. They were just clueless. Aren't you thankful that they were? Like, can anybody relate to those guys? When he was crucified, they all, except for John, ran away. Nothing he had told them was hitting home. They all ran away. John was the only one that stayed near the cross. So you say, Randy, it still just feels so far-fetched. I'd like to give you some evidences that the New Testament writers are telling the truth. You say, Randy, your slide's a little messed up there. I was trying to be cool. And I don't know if, like, my assistant said, Randy, is it supposed to look like that? It is. I'm just trying to be cool. You know, you want to hear something amazing? I hope you'll hear me. Did you know that all serious historians believe that Jesus of Nazareth lived and was brutally crucified in Rome? Did you know that? If you're a serious historian, you know this is true. There are some extra biblical accounts of Jesus, which for me is funny because people think that the biblical writers were stretching it. We can believe those that don't believe in God better, which is a funny thing. There's a guy that was a Jew working for the Romans named Flavius Josephus. He wrote a book called The Wars of the Jews, and it's still considered one of the best books on ancient history that you can find. He was a non-Christian Jewish historian working for the Romans. Now here's what he says. He writes this about 60 years after Jesus' death and resurrection, in about the 90s. Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man. For he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as receive the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. Now this is an interesting perspective because I think Josephus, who never became a follower of Jesus, thought the way many of us today think, and that is, okay, yeah, I believe Jesus was the Messiah. But he never encountered the risen Jesus. So it was up here, but not down here. And he says, and when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the 3rd day, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. And the tribe of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct to this day. Then there's the Roman historian and senator Tacitus. who referred to Jesus, his execution by Pontius Pilate, the existence of early Christians in Rome, in his final work called the Annals, and he tells all about it in the Annals. So, what about the New Testament writers? Are they telling the truth, or are they just kind of telling us stuff so that we can be brought over to their worldview? What evidence do we have that they're telling the truth? Now, the following are historical facts. They're historical facts. There was an empty tomb. Even the enemies of Jesus acknowledged there was an empty tomb, and they paid these soldiers who passed out at fear, they paid them to say that the body had been stolen by his disciples. Even they admitted that there was an empty tomb. There's no honest historian that can say otherwise. He appears to his disciples and to many others over a course of many days, and it's profound. Then the fact that the disciples believe it so thoroughly that they're willing to die for what they believe. Now, there are a few theories that try to explain away what happened with that empty tomb. There's, first of all, the conspiracy theory. This theory says that Jesus' disciples stole his body and told everyone he was resurrected. I was enjoying a YouTube video that you ought to look at sometime. It's put on by the Babylon Bee, which is a satirical group. And it showed the 12 disciples sitting around the campfire, and Peter says, "Guys, I have a great idea." "What?" "Let's sneak in. I know we got to face professional soldiers. We'll figure that out when we get there. And then we got to somehow roll away the sealed tomb rock, and we'll steal his body. And we'll tell everybody that he's resurrected." And all the guys are going, "Yeah, that's great," except John. John's going, wait a minute. What happens after that when we tell everybody that he's resurrected? He says, "It's going to be awesome, guys. You know what's going to happen? We're all going to be really murdered." And all of them go, "Yeah." And John's going, "No, that's not cool. That's not cool." You know, if you're telling a lie and you tell it clear up to your death, not a single one of them recanted. But the conspiracy says they stole his body. Basically, this would make the story of the resurrection the greatest hoax of all time. It couldn't be a bigger hoax than this. There can be. Now, I'd like to say that the conspiracy theory looks at the resurrection through the rear view mirror of Christian history. It's not worth looking at. You say, "What do you mean, Randy?" Well, did you know that the Jews, even though they had stuff in the Old Testament that talked about Jesus' death and resurrection, their worldview in the first century means that they had a Messiah. They were going to believe in a Messiah who would be defeated? No, they didn't believe that. They didn't believe he would be brutally executed, nor that he would be risen from the dead. The worldview of the Jewish believer a Jewish follower of God, of Yahweh, had no idea that the Messiah would be brutally treated, murdered, and resurrected. It just wasn't in their worldview. Now, the Jews did believe that the resurrection would be general, meaning that all the good people, especially the Jews, would be resurrected at the end of the world. But this had no connection to the Messiah. Absolutely no connection to the Messiah. It was just a part of what God was going to do. But it was going to happen at the end of the world, not after 3 days. And like I said before, the conspiracy theory does not take into account the sincerity of the apostles. It just doesn't take into account. They all suffered greatly, and not one of them ever recanted from their belief that Jesus was resurrected. As a result, no scholar today seriously defends the conspiracy theory. I can't find a single one. Maybe it's the apparent death theory. This theory says Jesus was only deeply wounded, but after being buried, he managed to escape. Do you imagine being beaten to almost till death, hanging on a Roman cross, and being able to move that stone by yourself? Okay, that takes more faith than Jesus being resurrected. And then crawling out of the tomb and convincing his disciples that he was resurrected. I feel great, guys. Excuse me while I faint. This theory is so highly improbable. I don't know if you knew that scholars all agree there's never been a single person that lived through a Roman crucifixion. They have absolutely zero knowledge of any person who ever lived through a Roman crucifixion. Now, there are one or two stories of other people groups that have crucified people, and a person or two lived through that, but not Romans. They were experts at it. And guys, we have this 21st century view of ourselves that we know things that they didn't. Like we know when people are really dead. And these Romans they thought he was dead, but he wasn't. Guys, if you lived with death at the level that first century people did, I think you would know what death is. I think you'd know what it looks like. And they were sure that he was gone. Then there's the displaced body theory. This theory says that Joseph of Arimathea temporarily buried Jesus in his tomb, but shortly afterward moved the body to a graveyard for criminals nearby. So when the disciples came on the third day and saw the tomb empty, they believed that he was resurrected. Wow, he's resurrected. I just don't think they could have come to that point. But the problems with this theory are numerous. First of all, Jewish law prohibited moving a corpse after it was interred, unless it was to a family plot. Second, the criminal cemetery was so close by, so there's no reason to bury Jesus in the tomb and then to move him to the other place. There's no reason to. If that's your end goal, is to get him in the cemetery for criminals, why not do that in the first place? The theory just doesn't stand up. Then there's the hallucination theory. The disciples didn't really see Jesus. They were all just hallucinating. I wonder how many of you have all hallucinated the same thing at the same time. Would you please raise your hand? He revealed himself in different times and different places to scores of people. Over 500 people saw Jesus alive. And frankly, if it was a hallucination, the disciples would have believed he'd been transported to heaven and believed that he wasn't resurrected, but that they were seeing his spirit. Oh, I'm seeing a hallucination. It's weird because Jesus says, okay, yeah, touch the wound. Touch the wound. Have you ever touched a hallucination? Frankly, ancients of all cultures believed that visions of the dead convinced them that the person was dead, not living. So if I had a hallucination of a dead man, I would believe as an ancient person that he was dead. So what is the evidence for the New Testament writers telling the truth? The first thing is really embarrassing stories. If you were trying to make sure everybody believed you, would you include the embarrassing stories like they all ran away? Or would you say, yes, we stood up to those Romans? Secondly, did you know that in the first century, a woman's testimony was worth less than a half of a man's? In court, very patriarchal culture. In court, you had to have two women to equal the testimony of one man. And yet, all four of the gospel writers say that Jesus first appeared to women. How embarrassing for that bunch of guy disciples. I'm being facetious because, like I said, Jesus wanted to get the word out. And somehow I think he wanted to say something about women, don't you? The first witnesses of the resurrection were women. That does not fit. And then, of course, why would you have the guys running to the tomb and freaking out? Where is he? If you were really wanting to convince people, you'd say, then Peter got into stairs. But I'm going to take out the guard. And then I took a right to the other guard. Man, it was glorious. You don't see, it's all embarrassing. It's embarrassing that they didn't even believe that he was resurrected. Even Thomas, it tells the story of Thomas. Yeah, right. Until I touch the holes in his hands and his feet, I'm not going to believe. These are embarrassing stories. Why would you include such embarrassing stories if it's not true? Here's an interesting thing. At the end of Matthew 28, look what it says. When they saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted. Risen Jesus is standing right there. And you're going, well, not sure. Not sure I buy this. For some of us, that's encouraging because we're struggling with doubts today. But that's an embarrassing story. The other thing that just puts it over the top for me is what I call excruciating deaths. My friends, so far I've tried to appeal to your mind. But, guys, until you meet the risen Jesus, it's not going to be a real walk of faith for you. But until you encounter the risen Jesus, it's just a head thing. You see, these guys all encountered the risen Jesus. And every one of them laid down their lives to suffer from that point on. Did you know that in this age of people deconstructing their faith, not a single one of those guys ever deconstructed? Not a single one of them did, because they met the risen Jesus. Have you met him? Have you met him? You see, I've had this in my head all through junior high and high school. And then I went to college and I had a crisis. And I remember crying the entire night to God. And I met the risen Jesus. I met him. You say, did you see him? No, I didn't see him. Oh, but it was so very real. You see, because they met him, they were all willing to die. You know that Peter, according to church tradition, was crucified upside down? Because he didn't want to be crucified in the same way as Jesus. Didn't feel like he was worthy of it. He was crucified upside down in Rome under Emperor Nero. Andrew was crucified on an X-shaped cross in Greece. James, the son of Zebedee, was beheaded by King Herod Agrippa in Jerusalem. John died of natural causes in Ephesus. However, there are stories in church history that they tried to boil him in oil and he wouldn't die. Philip was crucified or stoned in Asia Minor, which is modern-day southern Turkey. Bartholomew was possibly flayed alive. Thomas was impaled in India, where he was the first one to bring the gospel to India. There are believers in India today that say Thomas brought this to our ancestors, and he was impaled by a spear. Simon, the other Simon, was possibly cut in half with a saw, though other traditions say he was crucified. Judas, of course, hanged himself. Thaddeus likely executed, though the details are unclear. Matthew was killed by the sword in Ethiopia. Ethiopians still claim that Matthew brought the gospel to them. James the Just was thrown down from the temple and then beaten to death. Paul was beheaded in Rome. Luke was hanged in Greece, and Barnabas was beaten and stoned to death. Mark was executed and dragged through the streets in Alexandria, Egypt. Wow. Have you met him? Okay. Have you met him? Can you pray with me for a minute? Is there anybody here that would be honest with me and say, Randy, I think I believe that Jesus existed, but I think the fact that he was resurrected still strikes me as hard to believe. Would you pray for me? Like, here's my deal. I'm dubious. I'm skeptical. But I'm willing to believe if there's somehow a breakthrough. If that's you, would you mind just raising your hand for me so I can pray for you? Anybody? Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Anybody else? Now we're gonna have a response time right now. Thanks for being here and happy Easter.